cold morning in 1834, Commissioner George Nichols sat in the oak-panelled office of the London Parliament, methodically rereading the draft of the new Poor Law. Before him lay a document that would forever absolve men of the upper class of any responsibility for their relationships with domestic servants. Nichols was preparing to sign a document that would legalise a system in which a dismissed maid lost not only her job, but also her right to survive. This scene in the office marked the starting point for the most brutal social purge of the 19th century. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how this law allowed the true culprits to evade punishment and why luxurious Victorian mansions hid so many dark secrets. This topic conceals an incredible number of overlooked details that historians have sidestepped for decades. We're used to viewing the Victorian era through the lens of beautiful dresses, balls, and the refined manners of high society. However, behind the facade of this splendor lay a harsh reality that was not depicted in the popular novels of the time. You'll learn facts that will turn your understanding of morality and the laws of the most powerful empire on its head. Understanding these hidden mechanisms will allow you to view the structure of modern society in a completely different light. Ahead of us lie fascinating historical investigations based on real archives, police reports, and secret diaries. You'll see how the system of mutual protection among the aristocracy worked and how laws were enacted to protect the reputations of wealthy gentlemen. We'll examine the fates of specific individuals whose names were erased from history to preserve the social order. This information is invaluable for understanding how our modern rights were formed. Stay tuned so you don't miss the most shocking details of this carefully concealed historical era. Are you ready to learn the truth about what really went on behind the closed doors of London's luxurious mansions? A Victorian home in Belgravia or Mayfair was a strictly hierarchical system where every servant knew their place. Young women from poor rural families dreamed of entering the service of wealthy Londoners, seeing it as a ticket to a secure life. They were provided with a roof over their heads, regular meals, and a uniform which seemed like a tremendous blessing amid widespread poverty. However, this illusory security came at a tremendous cost, which many had to pay with their freedom. Inside the house, there was a strict division between the men's and women's quarters, but this was often violated by the employers themselves. The master of the house, his older sons, or an influential butler had unlimited power over the junior staff. Young maids depended on their favor, as any dissatisfaction on the part of their superiors led to immediate dismissal. Homeowners viewed domestic servants not as people with individual rights, but as property intended to ensure their comfort. This created the perfect breeding ground for abuses that society did not consider acceptable to discuss openly. Dr. William Acton, who studied London's underclass in the 1850s, gathered a wealth of evidence about the lives of domestic servants. He discovered that most of the women who ended up on the streets had previously worked as maids in respectable households. Acton described this process as an assembly line, where wealthy families exploited young women and then simply cast them out onto the street. His report showed that it was almost always men from the upper classes who initiated these relationships. At the same time, the full brunt of the consequences fell exclusively on the women themselves. In this situation, men were reliably protected by the collective solidarity of their class and unspoken rules of honor. An aristocrat could openly frequent gentlemen's clubs, discuss politics, and be regarded as a model gentleman. His reputation suffered not in the least from the fact that somewhere on the outskirts of London, a former maid was struggling to survive in the slums. Society turned a blind eye to men's weaknesses, considering them a natural part of human nature. All blame for violating moral standards was automatically placed on the woman who was said to have provoked the noble gentleman. The streets of London at that time were a cruel place where it was practically impossible to survive on one's own. Once out on the street, a former maid would quickly spend her meager savings on a cheap place to sleep. When her money ran out, she faced a choice between starving to death and seeking illegal ways to earn a living. Many tried to find work as laundresses or seamstresses, but the pay was so low that it did not even cover their basic needs. The system was designed in such a way as to leave a woman who had fallen from grace without a single chance of returning to a normal life. In his writings, Dr. Acton cited horrifying statistics that shocked some members of Parliament but did not change the system. He calculated that the average life expectancy of a woman who found herself on the street after being dismissed was only a few years. Acton tried to prove that society itself created the problem, which it then hypocritically fought using the police. His voice often went unheard in Parliament, where the very same aristocrats who defended their privileges sat. The law still sided with the powerful, leaving the weak to fend for themselves. Newspapers of the time regularly carried reports about women found on the banks of the Thames or in dark alleys. Journalists used these stories to create dramatic crime reports, without delving into the social causes of the tragedies. Readers devoured these stories with interest over their morning tea, treating others' misfortune as mere entertainment. Only a few reformers attempted to link these incidents to the harsh rules governing the dismissal of domestic servants. For most of the bourgeoisie, these women remained a faceless mass, unworthy of sympathy or understanding. The tragedy of dismissed domestic servants was a systemic phenomenon upheld at the highest legislative level. We'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about this division of responsibility between social classes? Share your thoughts in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to our channel to continue uncovering hidden pages of history with us. What if everything you were taught about Victorian morality is actually untrue? It's commonly believed that 19th century laws protected the family and society's strict moral foundations. However, in 1834, the British Parliament passed a document that officially enshrined male irresponsibility at the state level. This act went down in history as the Poor Law, and its most brutal provision was known as the Illegitimate Children Clause. This legal mechanism served as the perfect shield for wealthy landowners and industrialists. The ideological inspiration behind this reform was the politician and administrator George Nichols, whom we encountered at the very beginning of our narrative. He was a staunch follower of Thomas Malthus's economic theories and considered the poor a burden on the public treasury. Nichols argued that the old system of aid to the poor only encouraged their laziness and irresponsibility.
Back to work!
In his cold logic, there was no room for compassion, only numbers, taxes, and a desire to cut budget expenditures. He drafted a law intended to make poverty so unbearable that people would be afraid to seek assistance. Before this law was passed, a woman had the right to name the father and seek financial support through the courts. The system was far from perfect, but it still forced men to take at least some responsibility for their actions. George Nichols considered this rule unfair to respectable gentlemen who could be blackmailed by their former maids. He convinced Parliament that women were using these payments as a way to make easy money. As a result, the new provision completely stripped mothers of the right to demand child support from fathers. To make life even more difficult for those seeking assistance, the law abolished the distribution of money and food at home. Instead, a system of workhouses was established, modelled after maximum security prisons. A woman who had lost her job and had no means of support was forced to turn to these institutions. But entering them meant a complete loss of personal freedom and submission to the most humiliating rules. The state deliberately made conditions inside such facilities unbearable to deter potential residents. The drafters of the law took pride in having created a mechanism that saved tax money for law-abiding citizens. Their reports featured impressive graphs showing reduced expenditures, behind which lay shattered human lives. Not a single commissioner recorded statistics on women's deaths resulting from their inability to obtain financial support. Some clergymen timidly attempted to criticize the new order, pointing out its incompatibility with Christian charity. However, the higher clergy supported the government, declaring that severe trials strengthened the morality of the poor. The church often turned a blind eye to the sins of the aristocracy, preferring to preach sermons on humility to the powerless servants. This stance made the clergy complicit in a system that methodically destroyed the most vulnerable members of society. Religion and the law joined forces to protect the tranquility of the wealthy mansions from any claims. This historical document clearly illustrates how easily the legal system can be adapted to suit the needs of the elite. The 1834 Act remained in effect for decades, shattering the lives of several generations of British workers and servants. It shaped a unique social landscape where the fear of being fired was greater than the fear of death. Maids endured all manner of humiliation, knowing that outside their employer's home, only a workhouse awaited them. It was legalized slavery that required no chains, as the threat of poverty successfully served as their substitute. The workhouse system became a logical extension of this law, turning into the greatest nightmare of the Victorian poor. Did these women have even the slightest chance of finding justice in the courts of that time? Did George Nichols's ruthless economic calculation prove effective in practice? In the next chapter, we'll descend to the very depths of the Victorian justice system and see firsthand how this ruthless industry of survival operated. You'll discover the secrets hidden behind the high brick walls of state asylums. I will reveal the best-kept secret of the London aristocracy. When it was impossible to throw a maid out onto the street due to the risk of a massive scandal, the secret economy of concealment stepped in. Wealthy gentlemen who feared public exposure more than financial loss turned to special agents to resolve delicate problems. An entire underground industry emerged in London dedicated to the quiet isolation of unwanted women. It was a business built on blackmail, fear, and the vast fortunes of aristocratic families. Unscrupulous lawyers or private investigators often acted as intermediaries in these deals. They would find remote farms in remote provinces or secluded boarding houses on the continent in France or Belgium. A former servant was offered a deal under harsh conditions, complete silence in exchange for a small annual allowance and a roof over her head far from the capital. The woman was forced to sign documents waiving any future claims against her former employer. If she violated the agreement, payments would cease immediately and she would be left in a foreign country without a penny to her name. A historical witness to those years, journalist Henry Mayhew devoted years to studying the seedy underbelly of the British capital. In his investigations, he stumbled upon an entire network of fraudulent agencies that specialized in sending young women overseas. Mayhew discovered that influential fathers often paid for a one-way ticket to Australia or Canada for a servant who had misbehaved. The girl was given a modest sum of travel money and put on a ship that took her away forever. For an aristocrat, this was the ideal investment in preserving his impeccable social status. On the other side of the ocean, no one was waiting for these women, and they found themselves in the harsh conditions of the colonial settlements. Australian archives contain numerous records of the arrival of young British women whose pasts had been thoroughly erased. They had to start their lives from scratch, often agreeing to the harshest working conditions on remote farms. Many changed their names to sever all ties with Victorian England and its cruel laws once and for all. This was a forced migration, organised not by the state but by private individuals to save their own reputations. Those who remained in Britain and agreed to live in isolation in rural areas led the lives of true recluses. The farm owners, who were paid to care for them, treated them as free labour. The women worked from dawn to dusk with no right to leave the estate or interact with local residents. They were hidden from prying eyes as if they were dangerous criminals, even though their only crime was naivety. Gentlemen in London could sleep soundly, knowing that the living proof of their misdeeds was safely tucked away. Henry Mayhew described cases in which lawyers simply defrauded their influential clients, pocketing the money for themselves. They took enormous sums to support a woman, but paid her only a pittance. If the deception was exposed, the aristocrat could not go to the police, as that would mean a public scandal. Thus, the middlemen kept both parties in fear, both the powerless maid and the powerful lord. This shadowy system preyed on the vices of high society, siphoning off colossal sums from it. This hidden world vividly demonstrated the true cost of Victorian prosperity and impeccable manners. Behind the facade of strict morality lay a ruthless machine for eliminating inconvenient witnesses and whitewashing biographies. Aristocrats spent fortunes not on correcting their mistakes, but on professionally concealing them from society. This deception permeated all levels of power, from rank-and-file clerks to members of parliament and judges. The historical truth about these events has been preserved only thanks to the miraculously surviving archives of private detectives. The shadow industry of concealment became an integral part of the social structure of the 19th century. Studying these secret mechanisms helps us understand the scale of the hypocrisy that ruled the world during that era. We find traces of these shattered lives in old contracts, ship manifests, and police reports. If you're interested in such in-depth and unconventional historical investigations, please support us. Please like this video so we can continue to uncover the secrets of the past for you. What we found in the old archives of workhouses will make you shudder with horror. When the black market or charity couldn't help, the workhouse was the last resort. These were enormous buildings designed by architects to resemble fortresses or correctional facilities. Upon arrival, a former maid would be stripped of her own name, receiving instead a number and a coarse uniform made of stiff fabric. The facility's administration would take all her personal belongings, erasing her past identity forever. One of the harshest administrators of that time was Colin McDougall, the warden of the workhouse in Andover. He ran his institution with iron discipline, considering all those admitted there to be incorrigible sinners. McDougall skimped on food to such an extent that the residents were on the verge of physical exhaustion all year round. The women performed the dirtiest and most grueling work, unraveling old ropes, washing hospital linens, and crushing stones. For the slightest offense or complaint, they were deprived of their rations or sent to a dark detention cell for 3 days. Historical documents from Andover show that McDougall profited from food supplies intended for his charges. He purchased rotten vegetables and spoilt meat at rock-bottom prices, pocketing the difference from the state budget. This was a common practice among administrators who felt they enjoyed complete impunity under the law. Local authorities were well aware of the corruption, but turned a blind eye to it as long as overall expenses remained low. A person's life was worth nothing compared to the municipal council's balance sheets. Conditions inside the facility were deliberately made so degrading as to break any will to resist. Every morning began with roll call and the distribution of portions of watery oatmeal in which pieces of trash floated. Work continued for 10 hours a day in poorly ventilated rooms with an unbearable stench. Medical care was virtually non-existent, as the visiting doctor appeared only once a week for a perfunctory examination. The women slowly wasted away in these stone cells, deprived of even the slightest hope of returning to a life of freedom. In 1845, a massive scandal erupted when news of what was happening in Andover reached the London press. It turned out that the starving inmates had resorted to gnawing on rotten bones, which they had been instructed to crush for fertilizer. Journalists published shocking details, forcing Parliament to appoint a special commission of inquiry. Colin McDougall tried to destroy the documents, but the testimonies of the surviving women served as irrefutable evidence of his crimes. This case was a rare exception when the system failed and the truth broke out from behind the brick walls. The archives contain thousands of case numbers and brief records of those who passed through these millstones. Behind every dry line lies a story of betrayal, loss, and a cruel social sentence. The fates of the women in the workhouses were sealed the moment they were dismissed from the wealthy mansions. Could they have organized any kind of resistance within this harsh system? In the next chapter, you'll learn how they coped with this terrible pressure thanks to unexpected allies. We'll talk about those who weren't afraid to risk their reputations to save the lives of others. You'll see that even in the darkest times, there were people capable of true heroism. In the mid-19th century, British society seemed monolithic in its cruelty. But voices of resistance gradually began to emerge. One of the most prominent figures in this movement was Josephine Butler, who came from an influential family of reformers. She dedicated her life to defending women whom the state had officially declared outcasts. Butler possessed a brilliant education, a strong character, and incredible courage, which allowed her to speak out before hostile politicians. Her home became an unofficial headquarters where letters poured in from those who had lost all hope. Gladstone, together with his wife Catherine, founded the House of Mercy in Clever, which was radically different from state institutions. Unlike workhouses, women here were not forced to have their heads shaved, break stones, or starve. The Gladstones institution focused on restoring dignity, teaching new trades, and providing safe housing. This was the first step toward creating a system of rehabilitation rather than blind punishment. Their work proved that a humane approach benefits society far more than cruel isolation. Josephine Butler, for her part, collected thousands of signatures on petitions to Parliament. She travelled through industrial cities, speaking to workers who fully understood the heart of the problem. Her speeches were filled with concrete examples of how the law was destroying families and driving women to desperate acts. The police often tried to disrupt her speeches by provoking disturbances and setting hired thugs on her. But Butler did not back down, continuing her methodical work to tear down the wall of state hypocrisy. An important part of the resistance was the emigration assistance organized by private philanthropists. Caroline Chisholm, known as a friend of the emigrants, established an entire system for safely sending women to Australia. Unlike shadowy agents, Chisholm guaranteed her charges protection during the journey and assistance with finding employment in their new home. She personally inspected the ships, living conditions, and employers to rule out the possibility of fraud. Thanks to her efforts, thousands of dismissed maids were able to start a new, dignified life on another continent. Chisholm had to overcome resistance from officials who were unwilling to spend public funds on such programs. She literally lived on the docks, organizing fundraisers and negotiating with ship captains. Her incredible energy and talent as a negotiator made it possible to create a successful model of migration without government involvement. The women Chisholm sent abroad often wrote her letters of thanks, which she used as proof of the effectiveness of her work. It was a real path to salvation, carved out through bureaucratic obstacles by a single person. In London, secret societies also began to form among the maids themselves, even though this was strictly forbidden. Experienced maids tried to warn young girls about the dangers posed by their employers. They set up mutual aid funds, pooling a few pence from their wages to have a reserve in case of sudden dismissal. This solidarity went unnoticed by the aristocracy, but it helped them survive during the most critical moments. The women learned to rely only on themselves, forming hidden support networks in the basements of luxurious mansions. The efforts of Butler, Gladstone, and Chisholm slowly but surely shifted public opinion. Newspapers, which had previously published only mocking caricatures of the reformers, began to print serious articles about social inequality. People began to question the fairness of a system that punished only one side of the conflict. Debates began in Parliament about the need to revise the Poor Law and the provisions regarding irresponsible fathers. It was a difficult and lengthy process, but the ice finally began to break thanks to the persistence of a few individuals. This period marked a turning point in the history of Victorian society. The reformers' actions proved that even the most powerful system is vulnerable in the face of organized resistance. They paved the way for future legislative changes that would save millions of lives in the 20th century. Their names are forever inscribed in the history of the struggle for basic human rights. Society gradually began to realize that compassion must become the foundation of government. But this was only the beginning. An experiment that did not go according to plan forced the government to reconsider its views. The harsh law of 1834, conceived as the ideal tool for saving money, began to fail spectacularly on a national scale. Workhouses were overflowing, and city streets were flooded with vagrants whom the police could not control. Cuts to welfare benefits resulted in colossal expenses for maintaining prisons and the police force. The system began to devour itself, causing concern even among the most conservative members of Parliament. Legal battles intensified in the 1870s when more pragmatic politicians came to power. Under pressure from the public and constant petitions from activists such as Josephine Butler, Parliament was forced to act. Work began on a new bill designed to restore at least a minimal degree of responsibility to men. The aristocracy resisted to the very end, hiring the best lawyers to defend their long-standing privileges. Fierce debates raged behind the scenes, with the reputations of many noble families at stake. The result of these political battles was the Act amending the laws relating to illegitimate children, passed in 1872. This document dealt the first serious blow to male impunity by repealing George Nichol's controversial provision. Now, a dismissed maid once again had the legal right to take her former employer to court. The law established a specific amount of support that the father was required to provide to cover the consequences of his actions. This was far from full equality, but it was the first legal victory in many decades. However, the new legal precedent faced enormous resistance at the local level. Justices of the peace, who were often landowners and aristocrats themselves, were reluctant to rule in favor of former domestic servants. A woman had to endure humiliating cross-examinations to prove she had had a relationship with a gentleman. Lawyers for the wealthy defendants used the full force of the legal system to discredit the witnesses and portray them as frauds. Nevertheless, the very existence of this possibility caused many London gentlemen to become more cautious. The role of charitable organisations also gradually changed as they became more professional. Instead of haphazardly distributing food, they began hiring lawyers to defend the rights of former maids in court. This set precedents in which influential lords were forced to pay large sums pursuant to court rulings. The publicity surrounding these trials became the best deterrent against new abuses within aristocratic circles. The law ceased to be solely an instrument of oppression and began to fulfill its direct function of protection. Of course, the 1872 law could not instantly rectify decades of social injustice. Thousands of women remained in workhouses, unable to prove their case retroactively. Many men continued to use bribery and blackmail to avoid being summoned to court. Nevertheless, a crucial legal foundation was established, upon which all subsequent social reforms were based. The state finally recognized that responsibility could not rest solely on the woman. The legal battles demonstrated just how important legal support is for the most vulnerable segments of the population. They proved that even the harshest laws can be changed under pressure from an organized society. These legal battles laid the groundwork for modern labor and family law, which we now take for granted. The history of this law is a story of perseverance and common sense triumphing over the selfishness of the ruling class. Do you agree that knowledge of the law is the best defense against arbitrary power? This phase demonstrated that change is possible, even when the entire state apparatus is arrayed against you. Could this victory have brought back to life those who had already perished within the walls of the workhouses? Of course, for many, these reforms came too late. In the next chapter, you'll learn how these legal battles influenced the development of women's independence. We'll explore the new professions that former maids began to pursue as they escaped the dictates of Victorian mansions. By the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had opened up new paths to independence for women. The dangers of working in private mansions forced many to seek alternative ways to earn a living outside the household. Factories, plants, and textile mills began offering mass employment opportunities for former maids. Working conditions there were incredibly harsh, but they offered one key advantage: personal freedom after the shift ended. Women no longer lived under the same roof as their employers, which radically changed the rules of the game. Factory work meant a strictly regulated workday and a fixed wage, independent of the mistress's mood. Factory owners were interested only in labor productivity, not in the personal lives of their female workers. Leaving the factory floor guaranteed freedom of movement, and the opportunity to rent their own living quarters by pooling resources with friends. This financial autonomy became the best protection against harassment and blackmail by men of the upper class. Former maids quickly realized that hard factory labor gave them a sense of security they had never had in the mansions. The advent of the telegraph and the development of postal services created an entirely new class of professions. Young women began to train as telegraph operators, telephone operators, and postal workers, jobs that required basic education and literacy. These positions were considered respectable and provided a stable income without the need to serve their masters. State-owned companies became the first major employers to offer women relatively fair working conditions and pensions. This was a massive social mobility opportunity that allowed thousands to escape the trap of domestic service. The development of the healthcare system also required a large number of qualified caregivers and nurses. Florence Nightingale's nursing school transformed caring for the sick from a dirty job into a respected profession. Women underwent rigorous medical training, received a diploma, and gained the right to work in hospitals or private practices. Nurses enjoyed high social status and were protected by professional associations from the arbitrary treatment of employers. This path required iron discipline, but it offered absolute independence and a stable income for life. All these changes led to aristocratic families facing a severe shortage of domestic staff. Young women no longer stood in line to secure a position as a maid in London's Mayfair. Mansion owners were forced to raise wages, improve living conditions, and grant more days off. The fear of losing their staff compelled them to behave more restrainedly and respectfully toward their subordinates. The labour market itself resolved the problems that Parliament had been unable to solve for decades. The mindset of the women themselves also changed as they came to realise their economic value to society. They no longer considered themselves powerless beings whose fate depended on the mercy of a gentleman. The money they earned gave them a voice in the family and the opportunity to plan their own futures. Many of those who started out as ordinary factory workers eventually opened their own small workshops or shops. This was economic emancipation, which preceded the political struggle for equality. The transition from domestic service to professional labour became one of the major achievements of the late 19th century. It dismantled the old feudal system of relations in which a worker belonged to their employer 24 hours a day. The emergence of alternatives made blackmail and unpunished dismissals, which had ruined lives in the era of George Nichols, impossible. Women proved their ability to adapt to the new conditions of the industrial world and build independent lives. This mass migration of workers into the professional sector forever changed the face of the British economy. Every typewriter mastered and every telegraph key operated dealt a blow to the old order of the Victorian era. Technological progress became an unexpected ally in the struggle for social justice and human dignity. In the decades that followed, this foundation would enable women to begin their fight for full political representation. But the memory of those dark times, of workhouses and powerless maids, will remain forever in the National Archives. This story teaches us how economic freedom can overcome even the most brutal laws. But there is something else very important that you are about to learn. Surviving in the face of total social condemnation required tremendous psychological resilience. Women who had endured exile and workhouses developed unique coping mechanisms to adapt to a hostile environment. They learnt to hide their emotions, not to trust promises, and to rely only on their own strength. Many deliberately hardened themselves to protect themselves from further betrayals and disappointments. This inner armor was necessary to keep from going mad in a world that officially deemed you worthless. It is interesting to note how differently the fates of those who passed through the workhouse system unfolded. Some, having broken free, tried to forget the past as if it were a terrible dream, severing all ties. Others, on the contrary, became fierce advocates for the rights of the poor, using their experiences to help others. Such women joined Josephine Butler's organizations, becoming invaluable agents of influence among the working class. Their personal experiences were the best proof that the system needed immediate reform. Support from older, more experienced women who had already walked this path was of immense importance. In London's working-class neighbourhoods, there was an unspoken network where newcomers were helped to find cheap housing and food. Women who owned small laundries or sewing workshops often deliberately hired young women with tarnished reputations. They did this secretly without revealing their motives so as not to attract the attention of the police or inspectors. It was a form of women's solidarity that saved lives more effectively than government programs. Men from aristocratic circles, observing these developments, often felt fear in the face of growing female autonomy. Their familiar world, where everything was subject to their desires, began to crumble rapidly under the pressure of new economic realities. Some attempted to tighten morality laws, demanding harsher punishments for violations of social norms. However, these attempts appeared to be the death throes of an old world, incapable of halting the course of history. The era of unchecked tyranny within private mansions was drawing to its logical conclusion. The human capacity to adapt to the most unbearable conditions astounds historians and psychologists alike. Victorian women, deprived of education and civil rights, demonstrated incredible resourcefulness in their struggle for survival. They learnt to exploit the system's weaknesses, circumvent the law, and create their own rules of the game. Their resilience became the foundation upon which a generation of suffragists grew, demanding political equality. The story of survival turned into a story of political struggle that forever changed Great Britain. Archival documents revealing this dark side of the Victorian era were kept classified for many decades. It was not until the second half of the 20th century that historians gained access to police reports and medical records. These documents made it possible to restore historical justice and give a voice back to those who had been silenced. Studying these materials helps us understand just how dangerous the state can be when it protects the interests of only one group of people. This is a lesson that remains relevant for modern society as well. The psychological warfare waged by the state against its own citizens left a deep mark on the culture. It demonstrated that true strength lies not in wealth or titles, but in the ability to never give up. The heroines of our story proved that even after social destruction, it is possible to rebuild one's life. Their journey from utter despair to economic independence commands sincere respect. We are approaching the finale of our story, where all the threads will converge at a single point. To understand the scale of the chasm between social classes, it is worth examining the unique historical figure of Arthur Manby. This respectable poet and civil servant led a secret life that perfectly illustrates the hypocrisy of the Victorian era. By day, he moved in London's highest circles, socialising with famous writers and politicians in exclusive clubs. But by night, he took to the streets to secretly observe the lives of maids, laundresses, and street vendors. Manby kept detailed diaries in which he recorded, with maniacal precision, the daily lives of the capital's most disenfranchised women. His obsession with the working class led to a secret marriage to a simple maid named Hannah Calwick. This union was an absolute taboo in the 19th century, so he carefully concealed it from the public eye. To society, Hannah remained merely his maid, obliged to perform the dirtiest household chores. Manby relished this contrast, forcing his wife to call him Sir and refusing to acknowledge her as his equal. Their story demonstrates that even an aristocrat's sincere affection did not negate his need for power and domination. Hannah Calwick's diaries, which she kept at her husband's insistence, are an invaluable historical source. They describe in detail the grueling daily life of a maid who had to rise before dawn to clean the fireplaces. She described how she scrubbed her hands raw while cleaning the enormous house, all while her husband read poetry in the parlour. Hannah accepted these rules of the game, viewing her situation as natural and making no attempt to rebel. Her writings offer a glimpse into the world through the eyes of the very servants who were so easily cast out onto the street. Manby photographed Hannah as a dirty, hard-working woman, building his own collection. He made no attempt to spare her from hard labor or to provide her with an education befitting his wife's status. On the contrary, he romanticized her suffering and physical exhaustion, finding a peculiar aesthetic in it. This attitude was typical of the gentlemen of that era who admired the common people but did not consider them equals. Arthur Manby did not love the woman herself, but rather her social subordination and complete dependence on his will. By examining this story, we gain a better understanding of the psychology of men who refuse to take responsibility for their actions. To them, women from the lower classes were not fully human beings, deserving of respect or compassion. They viewed domestic servants as tools for satisfying their own needs, whether it was cleaning the house or physical intimacy. The Poor Law of 1834 simply enshrined this worldview at the state level. Changing the laws was impossible without a fundamental shift in this arrogant mindset. Gradually, thanks to economic changes and the efforts of reformers, this wall of snobbery began to crumble. New generations began to view the relationship between employer and employee as a contract between equals. The abolition of slave-like working conditions became possible when society stopped romanticizing poverty and subjugation. Hannah Cowwick's Diaries serve as a reminder of how deeply social inequality can penetrate the human soul. We are fortunate to live in an era when such relationships are condemned rather than accepted as the norm. This unique historical case brings us to the conclusion of our investigation into the fates of Victorian women. We have journeyed from the gloomy chambers of Parliament to the secret diaries of London intellectuals. Every detail comes together to form a complete picture of how the most sophisticated machine of social oppression operated. In the final chapter, we'll return to that very chamber in 1834 to see the consequences. We'll sum up this vast historical drama and assess the extent of the journey we've taken. Let's return to that very cold office in 1834, where the fate of hundreds of thousands of people was decided. George Nichols signed the Poor Law, absolutely convinced that he was in the right. He believed he was saving the British economy, but in reality, he set in motion an unprecedented social catastrophe. The document he held in his hands became a death sentence for generations of women whose only crime was poverty. This historic moment marked the pinnacle of state cynicism, cloaked in the form of a legal act. The consequences of this decision were immediate, manifesting in overcrowded workhouses and shattered lives. Nichols lived to a ripe old age, surrounded by honor and respect from his fellow civil servants. He never acknowledged that his economic calculations had led to the deaths of a vast number of innocent people. To him, they remained nothing more than a statistical error in the grand ledger of the British Empire. History is often kind to those who commit crimes with pen and paper rather than with the sword. However, time has set the record straight, and the 1834 Act has been recognized as one of the most shameful chapters in history. A system built on fear and isolation ultimately proved to be a complete failure. Economic and social development required free, educated citizens, not intimidated inhabitants of workhouses. Industrial cities needed a labor force, and factories shattered the aristocratic mansion's monopoly on women's labor. The economic expediency that gave rise to this cruel law ultimately brought about its own demise. The struggle for women's rights, which began with attempts to defend dismissed maids, grew into a powerful political movement. Josephine Butler and her allies demonstrated that justice must be defended, even when the chances of success are minimal. Their efforts led to a series of reforms that, step by step, restored human dignity to the marginalized. These changes laid the foundation for modern laws protecting maternity and labor rights. Without their hard and often dangerous work, our society would look completely different. We have traced the entire journey from London's luxurious Belgravia to the icy punishment cells of the workhouse. We have seen how wealthy men evaded responsibility by hiding behind lawyers and corrupt judges, and we've witnessed how new professions made it possible to break this vicious cycle of dependence. This historical process took decades, but it irreversibly changed the structure of human relationships. The Victorian era came to an end, taking its darkest secrets and prejudices with it. The final chapter of this story is not written in the Parliament building, but in the lives of millions of modern women. They are free to choose their profession, own property, and defend their rights in open court. This independence was paid for with the lives of those whose names we find only in old police reports. Remembering them is the best defense against repeating such historical mistakes in the future. Knowledge of the past makes us stronger and more accountable to those who will come after us. Our historical heroine is not one specific person, but a collective image of a woman who defeated the system. She went through denial, anger, and a workhouse and managed to emerge into the light of economic independence. Her journey proves that the human spirit is much harder to break than armchair politicians might think. We conclude our exploration of this complex, painful, yet incredibly important historical topic. I hope this investigation has helped you see familiar pages of history in a new light. We have examined the difficult path taken by 19th century women as they faced the betrayal and cruelty of the state apparatus. Behind the dry language of the laws lay the real lives of people who fought for their survival against all odds. Their resilience led to changes in the legal system and laid the foundation for modern labor laws. The culmination of this historical process was the attainment of independence and the dismantling of a system of legalized oppression. What other social issues from the Victorian era do you think have remained in the shadows of history? Please suggest topics in the comments for future videos that you'd like to see on our channel, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new in-depth historical investigations.